I had endured terrible treatment from my mother-in-law and my husband Ralph for years. After 30 years of marriage, I finally decided to divorce Ralph. I told him I couldn't live with him anymore and that I wanted a divorce. Ralph's reaction was swift. He quickly called his mother, who lived nearby, to tell her about my decision. My heart sank as I saw my mother-in-law rush into our house, her face beaming with an unsettling joy. Both of them started attacking me verbally, their faces twisted in mocking grins. My mother-in-law asked when I was moving out, her tone dripping with sarcasm. Ralph chimed in, telling me to get out quickly. I knew they were aware that it's impossible to move out immediately after deciding to divorce. Their cruel words were just another way to belittle me, and I felt a mixture of anger and sadness welling up inside. In a moment of defiance, I declared I would be gone in 30 minutes. I wasn't going to let them have the last laugh. I had a plan, and I was determined to execute it flawlessly. I calmly told them to take care of things here, my voice steady despite my racing heart. A moving company representative appeared, assuring me that everything was taken care of, including a hired car. As I was about to get into the luxurious vehicle, I saw my mother-in-law's eyes widen in shock. She sputtered, asking what this expensive car was all about. I felt a surge of satisfaction, knowing I was about to leave these people behind in the most dramatic way possible. I hoped they would be flustered and filled with regret. My name is Kimberly Johnson, and I'm 50 years old. I married Ralph Johnson in my 20s, and we had a son, Christopher. When Christopher was born, Ralph asked me to quit my job and focus on housework and childcare. Despite my reservations, I reluctantly agreed and left my career behind. I raised Christopher with love, but during that time, Ralph grew increasingly cold towards me, casting a shadow over my life. In those days, I simply endured the unreasonable treatment, trying to get through each day as best I could. I vividly remember one incident when my mother-in-law berated me for a dirty entryway. She sneered that since I was a full-time housewife, I should at least be able to keep the house clean. I apologized meekly and promised to clean it right away, my cheeks burning with humiliation. My mother-in-law didn't stop there. She continued her tirade, saying I was useless and that my college degree was worthless. Her words stung, but I had grown accustomed to swallowing my pride. After I became a stay-at-home mom, my mother-in-law started visiting our house every day. She would always find something to criticize, raising her voice and blaming me for every little imperfection. From the beginning of my marriage, she had disapproved of my college education. Lately, her favorite phrase had become, "What good is a college degree if you can't do anything right?" Despite her constant complaints, she never offered to help. Instead, she would take advantage of living nearby to burden me with her own household chores. She'd say things like, "After you're done here, can you clean in front of my house too? You're so inconsiderate, always needing to be told what to do." Whenever she spotted me going shopping, she would pounce on the opportunity to add her own errands to my list. Of course, she never offered to pay for her items. I remember one day when Christopher was crying and my mother-in-law cooed over him, calling him adorable. Her idea of doting on her grandson was limited to easy, pleasant moments. She'd never handle any of the challenging aspects of childcare. Everything difficult was left to me. When Christopher continued crying, she turned on me, demanding that I stop his tears immediately. She cruelly accused me of being a terrible parent for letting him cry. I knew she understood that babies cry. She had raised children herself. But any excuse to berate me seemed good enough for her. Ralph was no better. He never helped with household chores. The moment I quit my job, all the burden fell squarely on my shoulders. I felt increasingly isolated from the outside world. I recall a friend inviting me out for coffee, assuring me there were places with childcare services. With a heavy heart, I had to decline, explaining that I wasn't allowed to go out except for groceries. My friend expressed concern and offered support, but I could feel our connection slipping away. As these relationships dwindled, I found myself confiding in Christopher, even though he was just a baby. I'd tell him how I felt left behind by the world, my voice trembling with emotion. Christopher would respond with his baby babbles, which were a small comfort in my increasingly lonely life. Despite my love for my son, the stress from everything else was overwhelming me. I found myself in another exhausting confrontation with my mother-in-law. She barged in, demanding to know why I hadn't taken out the garbage yet, her voice dripping with disgust. She called me filthy and ordered me to do it immediately, her words cutting through me like a knife. I stammered out a meek yes, my heart racing with anxiety. My mother-in-law wasn't finished, though. She continued berating me, calling me slow and questioning why her son had married someone like me. Her words stung, but I had grown accustomed to swallowing my pain. Trying to balance Christopher's care with housework often left both tasks half done, inviting criticism from both Ralph and my mother-in-law. When Christopher turned 3, I considered enrolling him in free daycare to focus on housework during the day. However, my mother-in-law vehemently opposed the idea. She accused me of trying to abandon my child, her voice rising with indignation. As a stay-at-home mom, she insisted, I had no right to shirk my childcare duties. The irony of her words wasn't lost on me. She constantly criticized my housework and childcare, yet seemed determined to prevent me from finding any relief. It felt like she enjoyed seeing me struggle, piling on her own chores for me to handle. Ralph, unsurprisingly, showed no interest in the childcare discussion. When he learned that the daycare was free, he dismissively told me to do whatever I wanted and refused to engage in any further discussions. His indifference hurt, but I was determined to do what was best for Christopher. I decided to try and convince my mother-in-law, focusing on the benefits of socialization for Christopher as an only child. To my relief, my assertiveness seemed to work, and she reluctantly agreed. However, I could tell she was displeased at being out-argued. She couldn't resist making snide remarks, implying I was treating Christopher like a nuisance and declaring she would never do such a thing. Her words were meant to wound, but I tried to let them roll off me. Seeing Christopher happily playing with new friends at daycare brought me a sense of peace and reassurance. Unfortunately, my mother-in-law's surveillance of my life continued unabated. She would come by daily, warning me not to slack off on housework just because Christopher was at daycare. If I hadn't finished my chores before her arrival, she would fly into a rage, criticizing every unfinished task, even if I was in the middle of doing it. Her constant presence filled me with fear and loathing, but I felt powerless to stop her intrusions. The tension at home only increased when Ralph returned from work. He would announce his arrival by demanding dinner, his tone brusque and impatient. I'd greet him and assure him food was coming, trying to keep the peace. Ralph would snap at me to hurry, claiming he was tired, his lack of appreciation for my efforts painfully clear. These days, Ralph neither helped with housework nor childcare. Instead, he seemed to go out of his way to increase my burdens. He'd complain about repeated meals, accusing me of slacking off in my duties. When I tried to explain that some repetition was inevitable when cooking daily, he'd explode, asking if I was talking back to him. He'd remind me harshly that I owed my livelihood to him, his shouting so loud it would startle Christopher into tears. Ralph's treatment of our son shocked me. He'd yell at me for Christopher's crying, blaming my poor parenting skills. I couldn't believe this was the man I'd married, and I struggled to contain my frustration and sadness. As I desperately tried to comfort Christopher, I suggested to Ralph that he lower his voice to avoid frightening our son. This only enraged Ralph further. He accused me of calling him the bad guy, reminding me that as a stay-at-home mom, I had no right to criticize him. He'd repeatedly bring up money, emphasizing that without him, we'd starve. His demands for gratitude and respect felt hollow given his treatment of us. Ralph's obsession with money had led him to separate his salary from our living expenses, putting them in different accounts. While he did provide some money each month for household expenses, the amount had been steadily decreasing over the years. When factoring in the shopping my mother-in-law forced on me, the amount was far from sufficient. Explaining our financial shortfall to Ralph was always met with extreme reluctance to provide more funds. He'd accused me of laziness and wasteful spending, implying I was frivolous with his money. Despite this, he never intervened to stop his mother's shopping demands, which would have eased our financial strain. Instead, he blamed me for being unable to refuse her, painting me as the problem. It was clear he hated feeling like the bad guy and resented any of his money being used for anyone but himself. My relationship with my family was strained, leaving me with nowhere to go back to. Thinking about Christopher and the increasing expenses as he grew older, I felt trapped, unable to consider divorce. I told myself it was for my child's sake and decided to maintain this marriage, even as the stress continued to build inside me. As Christopher got older, the mistreatment that felt like harassment towards me persisted. My mother-in-law continued her constant surveillance, forcing shopping and housework on me while always finding fault and complaining. Ralph, on the other hand, often wouldn't come home without any notice. Yet, when he did return unexpectedly, he'd fly into a rage if dinner wasn't immediately ready. I can still hear his angry voice, demanding to know how I could be so incompetent at housework after years as a full-time housewife. When I tried to explain that I couldn't always have food ready when I didn't know if he was coming home, he'd accuse me of talking back. He'd remind me harshly that this was my job, that he was the one earning money, and that I should at least manage this much as a freeloader. Ralph's verbal abuse had been escalating recently, each word cutting deeper than the last. Christopher, now older, had grown cold towards both his grandmother and father, likely due to their treatment of him since childhood. While he was kind to me, he clearly avoided the other two, minimizing conversation with them. One day, Christopher approached me with a serious expression that made my heart sink. He told me that man, his way of referring to his father when he wasn't around, was having an affair. I was shocked, barely able to utter a response. Christopher explained that he and his friends had seen Ralph walking with a young woman. They had followed them for several days, gathering plenty of evidence. With a heavy heart, I looked at the photos Christopher showed me on his smartphone. There were pictures of Ralph arm in arm with a woman who looked about 30, entering movie theaters and restaurants. Some even showed them going into and coming out of a hotel and kissing on the street. I thanked Christopher for telling me, but asked him to stop his surveillance, worried for his safety. Determined to gather evidence myself, I realized I couldn't move freely due to my mother-in-law's constant watching. I decided to hire a private investigator, feeling it was time to let a professional handle this. By this point, any love I had for Ralph was long gone, and Christopher was an adult. I began preparing for divorce while collecting evidence of Ralph's infidelity. When I had gathered enough proof, I confronted Ralph, telling him we needed to have an important talk. His reaction was explosive, his voice rising in anger as he turned the blame on me. He had the audacity to claim his affair was justified, saying he couldn't possibly see a shabby old woman like me as a romantic partner anymore. True to form, Ralph refused to acknowledge his wrongdoing. Instead, he fell back on his usual refrain, reminding me whose money I had been living on all these years. He told me not to act high and mighty, to know my place since I had nowhere else to go. His words shocked me to my core, making me realize there were even deeper levels to his cruelty. While I had long since lost any affection for him and even felt hatred, I was surprised to find there was still room for my disgust to grow. As he ranted, the man before me began to look incredibly repulsive in my eyes. Ralph continued his tirade, insisting he was serious and that I would be out on the streets if he decided to leave me. He told me to behave and keep him happy if I didn't want to be divorced. Hearing Ralph's words, the last thread of my patience finally snapped. I told him firmly that I could no longer live with him and wanted a divorce. Ralph was initially surprised but quickly regained his composure, a malicious smile spreading across his face. He told me to do as I pleased, his tone dripping with contempt. Ralph's actions after this were swift. He called his mother, who lived nearby, apparently explaining that I intended to divorce him. My mother-in-law rushed over, her face alight with cruel joy. Both of them grinned maliciously as they berated me. My mother-in-law gleefully stated that they would finally be rid of a useless daughter-in-law like me who couldn't do anything right. Ralph chimed in, warning me not to expect any money from him as we would be strangers after the divorce. He claimed he was sick of seeing my gloomy face and told me to get out quickly. I gazed at them coolly, then began packing my belongings. I had been gradually preparing since the day I learned of Ralph's affair, so I was ready to leave immediately. My mother-in-law declared that I shouldn't even think about seeing Christopher again, claiming he was the family's grandchild who needed to inherit the family legacy and take care of them in their old age. Ralph chimed in, telling me I could live out the rest of my days alone and miserable. Their malicious laughter echoed in my ears, a sound I had grown all too familiar with over the years. I reflected on how my entire life had been spent under their constant belittlement and abuse. It baffled me how they could find such joy in attacking another person so viciously. I knew I'd never understand their cruel mentality, not if I lived 100 lifetimes. My mother-in-law's mocking voice cut through my thoughts, asking if I had finished moving out yet. Ralph immediately joined in, telling me to get out quickly. We all knew it was impossible to move out immediately after deciding to divorce, but that didn't stop them from using it as another excuse to ridicule me. But I wasn't about to let them have the last laugh this time. "I'll be gone in 30 minutes, I said, my voice steady despite the emotions churning inside me. After enduring so much, I was determined to have my revenge, not just for today, but for all the years of abuse. I had made my decision, and I was going to see it through. I had very few personal belongings in the house. Ralph and his mother would throw a fit if I dared to accumulate too many things. Ironically, their controlling behavior made my departure much smoother than it might have been otherwise. Still, I needed help with transportation, so I made a call. Within minutes, 2 vehicles arrived at our doorstep. I turned to the movers, grateful for their prompt arrival. "Please take care of everything," I said, feeling a surge of relief. One of the movers assured me that everything was under control and that they had even arranged a separate car for me. As I prepared to get into the luxurious vehicle they had provided, I heard my mother-in-law's shrill voice behind me. Her eyes were wide with shock as she demanded to know what this expensive car was doing here. Her outcry brought Ralph rushing to the doorway, his face a mix of confusion and anger. He stuttered, demanding an explanation from me, his face turning an alarming shade of red. Their extreme reaction made me wonder if they had jumped to some outrageous conclusion. Realizing this conversation might take a while, I asked the driver to wait and turned to face my unreasonable in-laws. I explained calmly that I had simply called for transportation, which was only natural since I was moving out and had belongings to take with me. My mother-in-law wasn't satisfied with this explanation. She shrieked, asking how I could afford such a luxury and accusing me of stealing from them. I found her accusation ridiculous, considering they had barely given me any money to begin with. I wish they would think more realistically. "Please don't say such slanderous things," I replied, my voice firm. "This is money I earned myself." I went on to explain that about 10 years ago, at Christopher's suggestion, I had started working as an online German conversation instructor. My German major from college had finally found its use. I had also done interpretation and translation work, but the online German school had been unexpectedly successful. Now, I even had my own company. Ralph exploded at this revelation, calling me a liar and questioning how I could have possibly worked when I never left the house. My mother-in-law joined in, still insisting that I must have stolen their money and demanding I return it immediately. It was clear that they couldn't grasp the concept of online work. Their outdated thinking was almost comical, but I supposed it wasn't entirely surprising. This was a world they had never engaged with, so they had no frame of reference. My mother-in-law, in her rush to judgment, lunged at me. Ralph looked ready to join her, his face contorted with rage as he shouted and stomped his feet. Just as the situation was about to escalate further, Christopher stepped out of the car, his voice cutting through the chaos. He confirmed that everything I said was true, explaining that he had introduced me to this work. He added proudly that I was now more financially successful than his father. My mother-in-law, startled by her grandson's sudden appearance, released her grip on me and turned to face him. She questioned Christopher's loyalty, accusing him of siding with me just because I was his mother. Ralph, still unable to accept the truth, seemed determined to dismiss Christopher's words as lies. Ralph's voice cut through the air, accusing Christopher of lying and being influenced by me. He ordered Christopher to come inside immediately, his tone harsh and demanding. Despite the shrill voices of Ralph and his mother, Christopher stood his ground, showing a strength I had always known was there, but rarely seen expressed so openly. My son, I thought with a surge of pride, had grown into such a remarkable young man. Christopher declared firmly that he wouldn't be going back into the house. He stated his intention to leave with me, his voice steady and resolute. I felt a pang of guilt, remembering how Christopher had never been allowed to move out even after becoming an adult. It was clear now that Ralph and his mother had intended to keep him close to care for them in their old age, as his grandmother had inadvertently revealed earlier. Christopher could have left at any time, but he had chosen to stay in this suffocating household out of concern for me, not wanting to leave me alone. But now, with my departure, Christopher too would finally be free. His grandmother's shrill voice pierced the air, accusing Christopher of forgetting the debt he owed them for raising him. Ralph joined in, demanding that Christopher apologize. My heart swelled with pride as Christopher calmly but firmly refuted their claims, stating that it was I who had raised him, not them. The unexpected pushback seemed to shock his grandmother, her face turning pale. She sputtered, unable to believe Christopher could say such terrible things. Ralph, grasping at straws, brought up Christopher's education, claiming credit for putting him through college. I watched as Christopher fixed his father with an icy stare, his next words cutting through Ralph's bluster. He pointed out Ralph's obsession with money, revealing that I had been the one paying for his education for quite some time. Ralph turned to me, his face a mask of disbelief and growing anger. I couldn't help but feel a touch of satisfaction as I explained how I had taken over Christopher's educational expenses once my business took off. I added that I had also been supplementing our living expenses, all without Ralph even noticing. The realization that he had been oblivious to these financial changes seemed to hit Ralph hard, and I found myself sighing deeply at his cluelessness. Christopher, too, wore an expression of utter exasperation. He pointed out the obvious that expenses from kindergarten to university couldn't possibly remain the same. He described how Ralph would only deposit a set amount into the household account, forcing me to beg for any additional funds needed. Christopher's disgust was palpable as he declared he didn't want to think of himself as related to such a man. Ralph, his face red with anger, blustered about Christopher's disrespectful tone. But Christopher, usually so calm, fixed Ralph with a fiery glare and shouted that I was his only parent. The sudden outburst seemed to startle Ralph and his mother into silence. I realized then how their bullying nature relied on the assumption that their targets wouldn't fight back. Christopher continued his tirade, explaining that he had only called them Dad and Grandma for my sake, to avoid causing me trouble. He laid bare the ugly truth, how Ralph had withheld money from the household to torment me, and how his grandmother had treated him like a cat, showering him with affection only when it suited her. As Christopher spoke, I felt a mix of emotions, pride in his strength, sadness at the pain he had endured, and a sense of liberation as long-held truths were finally spoken aloud. Christopher described how his grandmother had used him as a prop, dragging him out in public to play the role of doting grandmother while neglecting his actual needs and feelings. He recounted painful memories of being forced to accept cheap gifts he didn't want, only to be scolded for not playing with them. His grandmother would then publicly accuse me of taking away the toys she had so generously given him. As Christopher continued to speak, revealing more and more of the emotional abuse he had endured, I felt a deep ache in my heart. I had always known things were difficult for him, but hearing the full extent of it was devastating. Christopher's final words hung in the air, heavy with years of pent-up frustration and hurt. He made it clear that he had no intention of inheriting the family home or caring for them in their old age. As his grandmother attempted to speak, Christopher's glare silenced her immediately. Ralph's voice trembled as he claimed he had no memory of raising such an ungrateful child. Christopher's laugh was bitter and mocking as he questioned the very notion of owing Ralph and his grandmother any debt of gratitude. With a voice filled with long-suppressed anger, Christopher recounted how I had been the one to nurse him through childhood illnesses. He described how his grandmother would merely poke her head in, perhaps shove an apple in his mouth, and leave satisfied with her minimal effort. She never bothered to check his temperature, consider taking him to the doctor, or even think about medication. As Christopher spoke, I saw his grandmother shrink back, mumbling excuses that were barely audible. I doubted Christopher could hear her either. Her words probably weren't even forming coherent sentences. After all, how could she refute the truth? Christopher then turned his attention to Ralph, asking if he had ever truly cared about him at all. He pointed out how Ralph knew nothing about him beyond demanding he attend a certain university and major. Even then, Christopher noted, Ralph had shown no interest in his job prospects after graduation. Throughout his school years, Ralph had only cared about grades, and even that interest was superficial, merely an excuse to berate me if Christopher wasn't at the top of his class. I could see the fury in Christopher's eyes as he spoke, and it was clear that Ralph and his mother were trembling under that gaze. They had spent years berating me, safe in the knowledge that I wouldn't fight back. This was likely the first time they'd faced such raw anger, and it was clearly shaking them to their core. Their small-minded way of living had finally caught up with them. Despite the satisfaction I felt seeing them confronted with the consequences of their actions, I didn't want to see my son consumed by anger. I approached Christopher and gently patted his shoulder, suggesting he calm down a bit. My touch seemed to bring him back to himself, and he took a deep breath, visibly trying to control his emotions. I took the opportunity to explain that Christopher would be leaving with me. I mentioned my successful German conversation school, assuring them that we would have no problem supporting ourselves. I noticed Ralph's eyes darting to the hired car outside, and I could almost see the wheels turning in his head as he realized we weren't bluffing. His demeanor changed instantly, a sycophantic smile spreading across his face as he approached me. He pleaded with me to reconsider, admitting his wrongdoings and begging me not to go through with the divorce. I couldn't help but feel a mix of disgust and pity at his sudden change of heart. I reminded him of his mistress, suggesting he should be happy with her instead. My words seemed to shock his mother more than anyone else. She turned to Ralph, demanding an explanation about this alleged lover. Caught off guard, Ralph's eyes darted between me and his mother, stammering out weak denials. Christopher, however, was having none of it. He revealed that we had solid evidence, text messages, photos, everything needed to prove Ralph's infidelity beyond a doubt. As Christopher laid out the evidence we had gathered, including photos from the private investigator I had hired, I watched Ralph's face grow pale with sweat. I informed him coldly that I had been in touch with his mistress's husband, and that both of us intended to seek compensation for the affair. The mention of financial consequences seemed to hit Ralph harder than anything else. His face, already pale, now looked almost ghostly. I felt a grim satisfaction seeing him finally face the reality of his actions. Christopher, maintaining his composure, continued to confront Ralph with the harsh truth of his actions. He asked if Ralph had even considered the consequences of his infidelity, his voice dripping with contempt. I found myself oddly impressed. Just when I thought I couldn't think less of Ralph, he managed to sink even lower in my estimation. I pointed out how Ralph's spending habits had changed once I stopped pressing him about household expenses. His salary seemed to disappear as soon as he got it, while the money he provided for the household steadily decreased. As I spoke, I realized how Ralph had likely mistaken my frugality for acceptance of his stinginess, never imagining I was quietly building my own financial independence. His unchecked desires and reckless spending had clearly warped his sense of financial responsibility and moral reasoning. I watched as Christopher expressed his disbelief at Ralph's obliviousness to our financial situation. The household account had been nothing more than a pass-through for my contributions to cover our monthly expenses. Ralph's mother rushed to him, demanding answers about the affair and the compensation. Her first concern being money, rather than her son's infidelity, was depressingly typical of her shallow nature. Ralph, visibly uncomfortable, roughly pushed his mother's hands away. He insisted he'd be fine, mentioning his retirement fund and claiming he wasn't completely broke. I couldn't help but interject, wondering aloud if that would be enough to cover the compensation. From what I'd seen of his lavish spending with his mistress, I doubted there was much left in his personal account. My words seemed to hit a nerve, and Ralph's demeanor shifted from cowering to glaring at me with pure hatred. I deliberately shrugged, telling him his glares wouldn't change the fact that he'd have to pay compensation, nor would they magically produce more money. If he had been more prudent, or at least refrained from having an affair, things might not have come to this. I informed him that I planned to add the unpaid living expenses to the compensation amount, advising him to be prepared. Since I had started covering most of our living expenses, I had meticulously documented everything. When my business started generating income, I had consulted with a lawyer about our domestic situation and had been preparing for this moment. Unlike Ralph, who had been carelessly indulging himself, I had been planning ahead. As soon as Ralph's mother realized her son was financially strapped, her attitude towards us changed dramatically. Unlike Ralph's earlier attempt to ingratiate himself with me, she turned her attention to Christopher, her voice suddenly saccharine sweet. She pleaded with him not to leave, asking if he was really going to abandon her. Her performance, complete with tears and a pitiful demeanor, was almost comical. It amazed me that after everything Christopher had said, she still thought he might extend a helping hand to her. Did she not understand that even if he didn't hate her, he certainly didn't feel any affection for her? Her self-centered worldview allowed her to behave with such brazen shamelessness. Her thought process was remarkably self-serving and utterly despicable. Christopher glared at his grandmother with obvious disgust. He reminded her how she had always interfered when he tried to spend time with me, starting from his kindergarten days. His words seemed to freeze her in place, and before she could formulate an excuse, Christopher continued his cold assessment. He recalled how she had constantly badmouthed me, trying to turn him against me with comments about my supposed inadequacies in cooking and cleaning. As Christopher spoke, my own memories came flooding back. I remembered how she would deliberately speak loudly enough for me to hear, her words designed to wound. Now, confronted with the impact of her actions by her grandson, she seemed unable to respond. It was clear she had never considered how her behavior affected Christopher and me. Her only concern had been her own satisfaction, a testament to her selfishness. Christopher's final blow came as he declared that if anyone had been abandoned, it was me when she started speaking ill of me to him. He asserted that I was an excellent cook and housekeeper, always working hard, unlike her who had forced me to do her housework as well. His grandmother, finally faced with Christopher's clear aversion to her, collapsed to the ground. Ralph, who had always catered to his mother, was still muttering about his money, oblivious to her distress. It seemed that in the end, these self-centered individuals could only focus on their own concerns. Christopher and I got into the hired car, leaving them behind. I reminded Ralph one last time about the compensation and asked them never to contact us again. There was no response from either of them as we drove away. I didn't look back once as we left the place that had caused me decades of suffering. Later, I learned that Ralph had been ordered to pay substantial compensation to his mistress's husband as well, leaving him in dire financial straits. I felt a wave of relief wash over me when I received the compensation from Ralph's mistress. I heard she had also divorced her husband, and I couldn't help but think it was a small mercy that they didn't have children to complicate matters further. News reached me about my former mother-in-law's declining health since our confrontation. Apparently, she rarely leaves the house now, spending most of her days bedridden. I found it grimly amusing that on her better days, she still forces herself out, only to badmouth Christopher and me to anyone who'll listen. It seems her toxic behavior is finally catching up with her, as even those around her are growing weary and distancing themselves. I heard that even Ralph, her own son, is finding it difficult to tolerate her company these days. A part of me hopes she experiences the loneliness she so richly deserves in her twilight years. As for Ralph, his affair with a coworker has left both of them in an uncomfortable position at work. It's almost poetic justice, I thought, remembering all the times I felt small and insignificant because of him. When his mistress realized Ralph was broke, she quickly ended their relationship and even changed jobs. I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction knowing that Ralph, with no savings to fall back on, will have to continue working in that uncomfortable environment for years to come. His only family, his mother, does nothing but complain, and I doubt anyone will want to associate with a penniless, aging man like him. It seems he's destined for a lonely life, and I find myself looking forward to seeing how our paths diverge. Who will truly end up destitute, I wonder? Christopher and I moved into an apartment together. We had considered buying a house, but knowing Christopher would soon be living independently, an apartment seemed more practical. About 6 months after the divorce, Christopher surprised me by saying he had someone he wanted me to meet. My heart skipped a beat as I realized what he meant. When I met Christopher's girlfriend, I was touched by her kindness and her genuine desire to get along with me. Christopher told me that after all my hardships, he wanted me to be as happy as possible from now on. His girlfriend, though a bit clumsy in her words, expressed her admiration for me and asked if I could teach her various things. I nodded at their words, tears welling up in my eyes. After all the struggles I'd been through, it felt like happiness was finally raining down on me. As I looked at the young couple before me, I couldn't help but feel a sense of hope and excitement for the future. My life from this point on, I was certain, would be filled with smiles and joy. I thought about how far I'd come, from the trapped, unhappy woman I once was to this moment of contentment and possibility. The journey hadn't been easy, but sitting there with my son and his girlfriend, I knew it had all been worth it. I looked forward to the new chapters of my life. Perhaps I'd expand my business, or maybe I'd find time for those hobbies I'd always wanted to pursue. Whatever the future held, I was ready to embrace it with open arms, surrounded by the love and support I'd been denied for so long. As we sat there, chatting and laughing, I felt a warmth in my heart that I hadn't experienced in years. This, I realized, was what family should feel like: supportive, loving, and full of joy. I silently thanked the strength that had carried me through those difficult years and allowed me to reach this moment of pure happiness.